Chosen one, once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And that's exactly when your peace becomes their problem. There's something deeply unsettling about a person who knows. Not someone who suspects or guesses. Someone who knows. It's the kind of knowing that makes people shift uncomfortably in their seats the moment you walk into a room. The kind of knowing that can't be debated because it isn't just information. It's revelation. You didn't read it in a book. You woke up with it. And ever since that day, the world has been acting a little strange around you, hasn't it? Here's the thing. Psychologists have noted that the human brain experiences a brief moment of panic when one of its core beliefs gets challenged by undeniable truth. It's like an internal error message flashing. This does not compute. Most people quickly hit cancel. You hit update. And that single decision changed absolutely everything. Now you are walking around completely free, unbothered, and fully aware, while other people are glitching every time you speak. You're probably laughing at the absurdity of it all, because once you step outside the illusion, you realize how many people are still passionately defending their mental prison. They are repainting the walls, arguing about the curtains, and calling it normal life. They can't stand the fact that you know the truth. Not because you're arrogant, but because you are living proof that the cage was never locked. You saw the exit and had the courage to walk right through it. That's why your freedom offends them. It exposes the fact that, all along, the only thing keeping them trapped was the comfort of believing a lie. And now, here you are, wide awake in a world that is still pretending to sleep. Number one, you became unprogrammable. That's what really unsettled them. The moment you woke up to the truth, their favorite control button stopped working on you. They tried the guilt button, no response. The shame button, silence. The approval bait, ignored. You weren't being rebellious. You were just no longer hypnotized. You started thinking for yourself, and that is the one thing control-based people and systems simply can't handle. You stopped feeding the illusion that kept them powerful. Before the truth set you free, they could predict your moves because you operated on the same emotional scripts everyone else did. Fear of rejection, a need for validation, and a desire to fit in. But once the truth reprogrammed your perception, you realized most of those scripts were written by people who profit from your obedience. You stopped moving according to manipulation and started moving according to pure awareness. That's why they can't reach you anymore. Your mind officially stopped running on their software. Freedom doesn't always look like loud rebellion. Sometimes it's just a quiet refusal. You don't argue, you don't defend, and you don't over-explain because you know most arguments are just traps built to reprogram you with guilt or confusion. You've learned to see emotional bait for what it really is, an invitation back into their matrix of control. And every time you don't bite, it drives them crazy. They used to study your reactions. Now you give them none. They used to control your peace by withholding approval. Now your peace doesn't require it. They used to weaponize silence, but now your silence is your power, not a punishment. You simply outgrew their entire language of control. That's why you look calm while they look panicked, because their manipulation no longer translates on your frequency. You became a free thinker in a world allergic to free thought. They call it arrogance, simply because they can't call it obedience. You became unpredictable, and in the eyes of controllers, unpredictability is dangerous. But really, it's just independence. You're no longer programmable, and that means you can't be owned, steered, or emotionally blackmailed into submission. You didn't just find the truth. The truth completely rewired you. And when that happens, there's no going back to who you were before. You've outgrown their control panel, and that's why your very existence now exposes the limits of theirs. Number two, you're living what they only preach, and that's what bothers them. You became the living proof of what everyone else just talks about. They speak the truth like it's a theory, You walk in it as a reality. You didn't need a stage, a crowd, or a spotlight. Your daily life became the evidence, and that's where the tension started. People love to admire the truth as long as it stays at a safe distance. But when the truth shows up, embodied in someone real, someone like you, it exposes who is genuinely walking the walk and who is just putting on a performance. You used to blend in with people who constantly quoted wisdom they never applied. They would post deep words, talk endlessly about alignment, light, and faith, yet crumble at the slightest test. You, on the other hand, went through the storm, lived through every contradiction, and came out completely purified. That's the huge difference. Your deep understanding didn't come from reading about the truth. It came from being broken by it and beautifully rebuilt through it. You actually lived the sermons they just rehearse. You paid the heavy price for the clarity they only pretend to have. People love the sound of truth right up until it threatens their personal comfort. They will preach about forgiveness until it demands something of their own ego. They will talk endlessly about love until it confronts their selfishness, and they will preach about awakening until it disrupts their cozy illusions. But you let the truth change you. You didn't edit the truth to fit your fragile emotions. You adjusted your entire life to match what was real. That kind of authenticity naturally exposes people who are still acting, and that's why they flinch in your presence. Your life silently calls out their double life. You are not intimidating because you're loud. You are intimidating because you are so consistent. You don't speak from memory. You speak from true embodiment. There is a strong vibration of authority that comes with someone who has actually lived their own words, and it deeply unsettles those who only know how to repeat them. You remind them of the integrity they easily traded for convenience, and deep down, that's exactly why they resist you. Being near someone who actually lives the truth forcefully makes them face the hollowness of their own performance. You became exactly what they pretend to be. You turned belief into being and principle into real presence. You became living proof that truth isn't just something you say, it is something you become. And once you became that, every fake version of it started to feel exposed just by standing next to you. Number 3, their power only worked in the dark. That's the part they never wanted you to realize. Their entire system, whether emotional, social, or spiritual, depended entirely on your blindness. Their manipulation only thrived when you couldn't clearly see what was really going on. The exact moment you started recognizing patterns, reading energy instead of just words, and paying attention to what wasn't being said, their control started crumbling. They didn't lose power because they changed. They lost power because you finally saw the truth. Darkness doesn't fight the light, it just hides from it. Their influence was never real authority. It was a borrowed illusion. They only looked powerful as long as you believed their story. The second you questioned it, the spell broke. You saw that what they called power was really just an arrangement of fear and secrecy. It wasn't true strength, it was deep dependency. They needed your confusion to feel in control. Once you gained absolute clarity, they had nowhere left to hide. That's exactly why your truth irritates them so much. It's not that you're offensive, it's that your sharp awareness makes deception impossible. You became a human lie detector, and they can't stand that. You no longer respond to emotional traps, false guilt, or distorted narratives. You see straight through it all in seconds. Their favorite manipulation tactics stopped landing, and suddenly their charm turned very awkward. Their authority looked incredibly shallow, and their superiority became completely transparent. You didn't even expose them with words. Your quiet clarity did it without any effort at all. When you used to live in the dark with them, they seemed untouchable. You felt you needed their approval, their validation, and their version of the truth. But now that you clearly see beyond their illusions, their power looks incredibly small, almost childish. You finally understand that control is a fragile thing. It only exists as long as the controlled actually believe in it. And since you completely stopped believing in their fear-based structure, the entire operation fell apart. You became a bright light in a room that was never meant to be illuminated. And that is exactly what they can't forgive you for. Your awareness didn't just set you free, it completely revealed them. You made their hidden games visible. You turned their mystery into bright exposure. Their intimidation no longer works because the light never fears shadows. Their only weapon was your blindness. And now that you see, their influence has nowhere left to exist. Number 4, you realize the system isn't broken. It's designed that way. That deep understanding changes everything. Most people spend their lives believing they're fighting against a broken world that just needs better leaders, fairer laws, and kinder people. But you saw deeper than that. You saw that the system doesn't malfunction. It performs perfectly for the exact people it was created to serve. It thrives on mass confusion, dependency, and deep emotional exhaustion. It needs people to keep believing that the problem is temporary, fixable, and accidental. But you saw the real truth. It's intentional. The chaos is the actual design. That's why your awareness feels like rebellion to them. You stopped wasting your energy trying to repair what was never meant to work in your favor. You stopped begging for fairness from structures built on exploitation. You stopped expecting truth from institutions that profit from mass ignorance. When that clicked, you realized you weren't meant to fix the system. You were meant to outgrow it. And that is exactly where your liberation began. You didn't pick up a sword, you picked up discernment. You confidently walked out of the mental factory and stopped contributing your belief to their illusion. They hate that because awareness is highly contagious. Once one person sees the design, others start noticing the cracks too. The system doesn't actually fear resistance, it fears awakening. Resistance keeps you inside the game fighting the opponent. Awakening makes you realize the board itself was rigged from the start. That's exactly what you did. You stopped being a pawn and became an observer of the whole structure. That massive shift alone makes their control useless. Now they try to label you as difficult, cynical, or detached. But really, you're just clear-eyed. You've stopped trying to play fair in a setup that's completely built on deceit. You've accepted that true peace doesn't come from fixing corruption. It comes from refusing to feed it anymore. You are not angry. You are awake. And that makes you completely untouchable. You saw the world not as it pretends to be, but exactly as it actually is. And once you did that, absolutely no illusion could ever hold you down again. You didn't rebel out of hate. You awakened out of pure clarity. You saw the cage not as a random accident, but as intentional architecture. And by simply walking away from it, you exposed the entire blueprint itself. Number 5, you know that truth isn't comfortable. It's cataclysmic. It doesn't come just to make you feel good. It comes to make you real. The truth has never been polite. It doesn't whisper quietly, it totally exposes. It rips apart every single illusion you've ever used to protect your fragile ego. And that is exactly what most people simply can't handle. They only want a truth that flatters them, not a truth that transforms them. You had to let the truth break you, and that's exactly why you carry a deep substance they can't relate to. You didn't learn true wisdom from sitting in comfort. You learned it from total collapse. When the truth entered your life, it didn't arrive with calming music and sweet healing words. It came exactly like a massive earthquake, shaking every false foundation you ever stood upon. It forcefully made you confront exactly who you really were, without all the fake layers, cheap excuses, or worldly labels. That intense process wasn't glamorous at all. It was incredibly painful. You had to completely lose your old self just to become your true, authentic one. But while you were allowing yourself to be rebuilt, They were busy protecting the fake versions of themselves they haven't ever dared to question. That is the massive difference between you. They actively avoid the truth because the truth requires real accountability. It demands actual change, not just endless discussion. It demands that you completely stop blaming others and finally start transforming yourself. And most people would much rather live comfortably wrong than uncomfortably right. But you chose the much harder path. You let the truth strip you of all the illusions that once made you feel so safe. And even though it left you completely exposed, it also made you incredibly powerful. There is absolutely nothing left to manipulate when you no longer live in a state of denial. That is exactly why your sheer presence is so unsettling to them. You constantly remind them of exactly what they have buried. You stand tall as living proof that facing the raw truth won't actually kill you. It will completely free you. But true freedom always comes with deep scars, and not everyone is willing to earn theirs. They just keep polishing their fake illusions, calling it balance, and running away from anything that challenges their false peace. You, on the other hand, let the heavy storm hit, and when it passed, you were completely reborn. The truth destroyed your cozy comfort, but it built your deep clarity. You lost the illusion of control, but you gained real divine alignment. And now, when they look at you and see how calm and unshaken you are, they don't understand that it is not because you've avoided the chaos. It is entirely because you have already survived it. Number 6. You became emotionally independent. That is exactly when everything shifted. You stopped being their emotional supply, their easy source of energy, validation, and control. You completely stopped reacting to their shifting moods, heavy guilt trips, or toxic silent treatments. You stopped chasing fake closure, stopped begging to be deeply understood, and totally stopped explaining yourself to people who were absolutely never listening to you anyway. That specific kind of detachment isn't coldness, it is pure power. You finally realize that your inner peace doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. Now they have absolutely no idea what to do with you. Your absolute calm makes them incredibly anxious. Your deep silence doesn't mean defeat, it means they've completely lost access to you. Before, they could pull your emotions exactly like puppet strings. One harsh word from them, and you would spiral out of control. One tiny rejection, and you would question your entire worth. But the raw truth broke that toxic dependency. You finally saw the pattern. You saw exactly how people who crave control absolutely depend on emotional chaos just to feel important. Once you permanently withdrew your participation, their influence completely dried up. They cannot manipulate someone who simply no longer reacts. That is exactly why your deep peace feels so highly offensive to them. You became a mirror, showing them exactly how incredibly little control they truly have. It is definitely not arrogance. It is perfect balance. You stopped trading your inner stability for temporary, cheap approval. You completely stopped mistaking intense emotional drama for a real connection. You finally realized that real love, real peace, and real self-worth absolutely do not fluctuate based on exactly how someone else feels about you that day. You built immense emotional wealth, the kind that completely refuses to collapse just because someone decides to withdraw their affection. Emotional independence is not about not caring. It is about caring from a position of massive strength, not desperation. You still love deeply, but you completely refuse to lose yourself in the process. You definitely still forgive, but you do not invite toxic people back into your life to destroy your hard-earned peace all over again. That completely unnerves the people who once heavily depended on your deep empathy just to manipulate you. They desperately miss the old version of you that over-explained, constantly over-apologized, and always over-gave. That old version no longer exists. Now you are perfectly steady, deeply grounded, quiet, and wonderfully self-contained. You completely know how to regulate your own energy without desperately needing external chaos just to remind you that you are alive. And that is what real freedom is. The absolute truth didn't just open your eyes. It completely gave you true emotional sovereignty. They cannot feed off your energy anymore because you completely stopped serving them your reactions on a silver platter. You perfectly learn that true peace is not ever found in control. It is beautifully found in absolutely not being controlled. Number 7. You beautifully discovered that what society calls normal is really just a highly controlled frequency. That massive realization completely changes the way you view absolutely everything. What normal people call normal isn't actually a sign of true sanity. It is a glaring signal of deep programming. Society has heavily trained absolutely everyone to think, feel, and automatically respond strictly within a very narrow emotional and mental range. It is a specific frequency heavily calibrated for total compliance. Just high enough for a person to function, but absolutely never high enough to truly question things. Most people live their entire lives stuck in that exact frequency, truly believing it is absolute reality. But you tuned completely out of it, and the exact moment you did, you instantly became a problem. You started clearly noticing exactly how this normality highly rewards blind conformity and severely punishes true awareness. If you dare to question the mainstream narrative, you are quickly labeled as negative. If you flatly refuse to blindly follow trends, you are called difficult. If you fiercely protect your inner peace, you are deemed antisocial. That is exactly how the corrupt system perfectly keeps itself totally intact, by quickly labeling highly independent thinkers as completely defective. You beautifully learned that what society calls crazy is very often just what they call people who have finally unplugged from the massive collective hypnosis. It is absolutely not madness. It is pure mental freedom. When you completely stopped resonating with that highly controlled frequency, your entire energy shifted. You totally stopped chasing validation directly from the exact same people who are still trapped in endless cycles of loud noise, petty drama, and constant distraction. You no longer needed to fit in, because you clearly saw that perfectly fitting in heavily requires severely shrinking yourself. You perfectly realized that being normal is completely designed to forcefully make you doubt your own authenticity. It aggressively trains you to silence your deep intuition, ignore your beautiful spirit, and blindly follow incredibly predictable scripts that perfectly keep you completely safe, but absolutely never free. That is exactly why they react to you the way they do. You carry a unique frequency that absolutely doesn't match their heavy calibration. You smoothly move with deep awareness in a busy world entirely built on blind automation. You aren't tuned into their toxic gossip, deep fear, or shallow trends, and that totally unnerves people who desperately need constant distraction just to feel secure. They don't understand that your deep peace absolutely isn't apathy. It is pure clarity. You have simply stopped vibrating to the exact rhythm of their manipulation. The truth perfectly made you a rare anomaly, and beautiful anomalies are always misunderstood long before they are deeply respected. You no longer need to drastically lower your pure energy just to be accepted. You totally stopped tuning into their chaos and beautifully started broadcasting pure authenticity. That is exactly why they quickly call you different. Your pure signal is vastly too strong for their weak system to process. Being normal was never the real truth. It was simply a heavy frequency of total control. You have beautifully transcended it, and that is exactly what real spiritual awakening truly feels like. You are finally perfectly in tune with yourself and absolutely not the program. Number 8. You clearly see exactly how people actually worship their own captivity, and that massive realization hits much harder than absolutely anything else. It is entirely one thing to be totally trapped. It is a completely different thing to actually love the very trap itself. You learned that most people don't actually want true freedom at all. They desperately want cozy comfort, cleverly dressed up to look like liberty. They vastly prefer the easy predictability of their heavy chains completely over the scary uncertainty of true, real independence. Their daily routines, their endless excuses, their constant victimhood, those are the exact walls of the mental prison they have beautifully decorated and finally learned to call home. When you broke completely free, you didn't just challenge the corrupt system. You directly challenged their fragile sense of safety. True freedom completely looks deeply romantic, right up until you realize that it forcefully demands real accountability. When you truly wake up, there is absolutely no one left for you to quickly blame. You cannot hide behind toxic manipulation, society's rules, or exactly how you were raised. That is exactly why most normal people actively avoid it. Freedom perfectly means fully facing yourself, and that is far more terrifying than absolutely any external physical cage. People get deeply attached to their daily suffering entirely because it gives them a solid identity. They completely know exactly who they are when they are in deep pain. They perfectly know who they are when they are deeply limited. If you take that completely away, they forcefully have to meet their actual, real self, the exact one they have been desperately avoiding their entire life. When you perfectly broke your heavy chains, you unknowingly exposed exactly how deeply other people actively love theirs. Your beautiful liberation forcefully made them incredibly uncomfortable, absolutely not because you personally did anything directly to them, but entirely because it perfectly revealed exactly how incredibly small they have actively chosen to live. You beautifully became a shining mirror that perfectly reflected their deep complacency. Instead of being deeply inspired by you, they instantly grew incredibly defensive. They will quickly mock your brave choices, heavily downplay your massive growth, or loudly call you extremely arrogant entirely because it is vastly easier to ridicule true freedom than it is to admit they have completely surrendered theirs. You learn that not everyone is totally ready to be completely free. Some people desperately need to comfortably stay exactly inside the grand illusion of control, because true, raw freedom would completely dismantle absolutely everything they deeply believe about themselves. So they fiercely defend their dark captors, blindly obey toxic systems that heavily exploit them, and loudly mock absolutely anyone who actually dares to leave. That is absolutely not basic stupidity. It is pure spiritual dependency. They heavily confuse simple familiarity exactly with real safety. And absolutely anything that directly threatens that familiarity feels exactly like a massive attack. You beautifully broke that dark pattern. You completely stopped worshiping the cozy cage and confidently walked right out into the grand unknown. That is exactly what absolutely terrifies them. That your massive courage beautifully exposes their comfortable complacency. You didn't just successfully escape. You perfectly proved that the heavy door was absolutely never even locked. And once someone clearly sees that, they can absolutely never unsee it, even if they actively choose to comfortably stay completely inside. Number 9. You perfectly expose the true currency of deception, and that completely shook absolutely everything. You deeply realized that dark lies absolutely don't survive just because normal people blindly believe them. They perfectly survive entirely because people heavily benefit from them. Every single lie, absolutely no matter how incredibly small, has a clear payoff. Some people easily lie just for quick attention, others do it for heavy power, and others do it just to quickly avoid real accountability. But right behind every single deception is a completely unspoken, dirty transaction. Someone always gains something from it. Cheap sympathy, tight control, dirty money, fake status, or shallow validation. Once you clearly saw that, you completely stopped playing their dirty game. You totally stopped funding their massive economy of dishonesty with your quiet silence, your easy tolerance, or your blind agreement. And that is exactly when you became incredibly dangerous. Not at all because you actively attack them, but entirely because you perfectly expose them. People who heavily thrive in deep deceit absolutely don't fear the pure truth itself. They completely fear deep exposure. Your raw honesty cleanly cuts right through the fake social contracts that easily allow absolutely everyone to just pretend. It forcefully forces people to either bravely live truthfully or completely lose all access to your pure energy. They absolutely cannot manipulate you anymore entirely because you clearly see the highly hidden price tags perfectly attached to every single false narrative. You completely stopped giving cheap discounts on your deep discernment. You proudly started calling dirty things exactly by their real, true names. It is toxic manipulation, not love. It is deep projection, not helpful advice. It is gross exploitation, not a grand opportunity. That deep clarity alone completely bankrupts exactly those who heavily depend entirely on mass confusion just to feel powerful. You perfectly learned that dark deception is an active business, absolutely not a random accident. It heavily runs on fake emotional investments, people eagerly trading their true authenticity just for cheap approval. They constantly keep up fake appearances perfectly to protect a fragile image, to maintain toxic relationships, or just to stay incredibly comfortable. You completely broke that dark cycle entirely by beautifully valuing deep peace completely over fake pretense. You absolutely no longer care exactly who likes you, just as long as you are perfectly aligned with the absolute truth. And that beautiful independence completely destroyed the toxic leverage others once tightly had entirely over you. Now, your raw honesty perfectly feels incredibly violent to them entirely because it completely dismantles the grand illusion that heavily feeds their fragile identity. The pure truth has a beautiful way of completely collapsing absolutely all false hierarchies. It perfectly strips away fake titles, shallow status, and fake facades, right until absolutely all that is left is true character. You absolutely don't even need to actively expose absolutely anyone publicly. Your pure presence beautifully does it completely silently. You proudly represent deep integrity exactly in a broken world that eagerly trades it away for cheap convenience. You completely didn't just speak the raw truth. You beautifully became entirely unprofitable exactly to deep deception. And that is exactly what deeply threatens them the absolute most. When dark lies completely stop paying off, their entire fake system perfectly falls completely apart. You absolutely didn't actively fight the dark lie. You simply completely stopped investing directly in it. And exactly once you did, the entire dark market of toxic manipulation perfectly started completely crashing right before their very eyes. Number 10. You perfectly realize that the absolute truth absolutely isn't just a simple concept. It is a powerful vibration. It is absolutely not just something you simply know in your head. It is absolutely something you completely become. You totally stop treating the pure truth exactly like a simple opinion to angrily argue about and perfectly started understanding it as a deep magnetic energy that absolutely cannot ever be faked. It absolutely doesn't live inside a loud debate. It beautifully lives entirely in perfect alignment. That is exactly why, exactly once you perfectly aligned completely with it, absolutely everything all around you beautifully began to completely shift, sometimes incredibly violently. People you once easily fit in with suddenly absolutely couldn't stand your pure energy. Casual conversations perfectly started feeling incredibly heavier, and normal spaces became deeply revealing. It absolutely wasn't entirely because you totally changed exactly who you completely were. It is entirely because the pure truth completely changed your entire frequency, and dark falsehood absolutely couldn't stand being anywhere near it anymore. The pure truth completely carries a powerful vibration that totally disturbs all fake illusions. It absolutely doesn't stop to ask for any permission. It beautifully exposes things completely naturally. You can calmly walk right into a crowded room and completely without ever saying a single word, the entire atmosphere perfectly changes. Fake masks suddenly feel incredibly heavier, false pretenses perfectly start cracking wide open, and people either completely align with you or totally avoid you. That is absolutely not spiritual arrogance. That is pure magnetic resonance. When you perfectly vibrate exactly at the high level of absolute truth, you completely unconsciously broadcast pure light right into absolutely any dark environment that is still heavily dependent entirely on deep deception. You absolutely didn't consciously choose to actively expose absolutely anything. You simply perfectly exist exactly as pure clarity, and that beautiful fact alone beautifully becomes a massive confrontation exactly for all those who heavily thrive inside deep pretense. Most normal people actively treat the pure truth exactly as basic information. They sit and study it, they memorize it, and they love to quote it, but they absolutely never actually live it. You perfectly learned that the real, absolute truth completely can't be neatly stored inside a human intellect entirely, because it is absolutely not just mental, it is incredibly magnetic. It perfectly reorganizes all your deep emotions, all your true intentions, and all your daily choices, right until absolutely everything that is completely inauthentic totally falls beautifully away. It absolutely doesn't care at all about your cozy comfort, your fragile image, or your grand plans. The pure truth absolutely doesn't just inform you, it completely transforms you. It perfectly rewires the exact way you completely see, deeply feel, and beautifully move completely through this life. That is exactly why, exactly once it perfectly gets deep inside you, there's absolutely no going completely back. And right now, your pure energy itself beautifully tells the entire story. You absolutely don't have to angrily argue, desperately prove, or heavily defend absolutely anything at all. Your powerful vibration completely already declares it. People can deeply feel it completely, even if they absolutely can't clearly articulate it. They either deeply feel strongly drawn completely to it, or totally repelled perfectly by it. But they absolutely cannot be totally indifferent perfectly to it. The pure truth absolutely isn't incredibly loud, but it is completely undeniable. You beautifully became a walking, breathing frequency of pure exposure. And that is exactly why your very existence completely stirs up massive reactions. You absolutely no longer need to speak the pure truth just for cheap validation. You beautifully radiate it completely effortlessly. And that is exactly what perfectly makes you entirely unshakable. Because pure energy absolutely doesn't ever lie, and you have beautifully become entirely one with the powerful vibration that absolutely never will. Number 11. You completely know that total exposure is the universe's ultimate justice system. You perfectly stopped wasting your precious energy desperately trying to prove exactly what time itself is already perfectly programmed to beautifully reveal. You have completely learned that the absolute truth absolutely doesn't need a loud spokesperson. It simply just needs quiet patience. You absolutely don't chase after cheap revenge entirely, because you have clearly seen exactly how every single dark lie eventually perfectly decays right under its very own heavy weight. You perfectly understand the beautiful rhythm of divine law, that absolutely nothing deeply hidden can ever stay completely hidden exactly once pure light beautifully touches it. You absolutely don't even have to actively lift a single finger. Your pure presence alone beautifully accelerates the massive unveiling. That is exactly why people who actively live inside deep deceit completely panic the moment you calmly walk right in. They can deeply sense that your pure energy absolutely doesn't play by cheap human politics. It perfectly reports directly entirely to the universe, You have beautifully witnessed exactly how total exposure absolutely doesn't come directly through chaotic noise, but completely through perfect divine orchestration. It beautifully happens incredibly quietly, perfectly timed, and completely without your active involvement. The exact same ones who desperately tried to completely bury you totally end up actively digging up their very own dark truth entirely, while you beautifully stay completely still. That is the incredible beauty of deep spiritual law. It absolutely doesn't desperately seek cheap approval. It perfectly executes true balance. When you beautifully carry divine truth, you completely become a clear mirror, absolutely not a harsh judge. You absolutely don't actively wish for anyone's massive downfall. You beautifully simply reveal a perfect reflection. And that clear reflection is totally unbearable, exactly to absolutely anyone who has completely built their entire identity entirely on toxic manipulation. The universe's true justice absolutely doesn't use human courts or public opinions. It perfectly uses deep vibration. Every single human action emits a clear frequency, and all frequencies perfectly return right back home. Dark lies constantly vibrate incredibly low, and the absolute truth absolutely always completely outlasts them. That is exactly why massive exposure absolutely isn't cruel punishment. It is perfect correction. It is absolutely not cheap vengeance. It is perfect alignment. You have beautifully learned to completely trust that divine process. You absolutely no longer loudly announce exactly what is perfectly about to beautifully unfold. You calmly let divine timing beautifully expose exactly what human deceit desperately tried to heavily hide. That is also exactly why your deep silence is so incredibly powerful. Not at all because it is totally passive, but entirely because it is deeply prophetic. You completely know that massive exposure absolutely doesn't need your human words. It perfectly uses your pure energy exactly as hard evidence. Exactly those who desperately tried to heavily distort your good name totally end up actively testifying directly against themselves completely without even realizing it. They simply call it karma, but you completely understand it so much deeper than that. It is perfect cosmic accountability. The vast universe absolutely never forgets pure frequencies, and entirely because you have beautifully stayed completely in deep integrity, the absolute truth perfectly fights entirely for you exactly in high dimensions you absolutely don't even clearly see. You have beautifully become living, breathing proof exactly that massive exposure absolutely isn't deep cruelty. It is perfect divine order, beautifully restoring itself entirely. Number 12. You completely understand that true awakening is heavy isolation long before it is beautiful liberation. You have bravely lived straight through the deep silence that most normal people completely fear. You deeply know that true enlightenment absolutely doesn't begin with bright light. It perfectly begins with heavy loss. Exactly when the absolute truth perfectly started to completely open your eyes, it also heavily closed heavy doors you truly thought would absolutely always stay completely open. You beautifully discovered exactly that the true path perfectly to pure clarity is heavily paved entirely with deep separation. Every single time you perfectly leveled completely up, someone else totally fell completely away. Absolutely not because you suddenly became heavily arrogant, but entirely because they absolutely refused to actively face the true version of themselves that your massive growth beautifully exposed. That is the painful paradox of true awakening. It beautifully saves you, but it also completely strips you totally bare. You perfectly learn that deep solitude absolutely isn't cruel punishment. It is perfect purification. It is exactly where dark illusions beautifully die completely off, exactly one by one. You totally stopped desperately chasing cheap validation and perfectly started actively confronting the exact parts of yourself that deeply needed to be clearly seen, beautifully healed, and heavily strengthened. That intense process absolutely wasn't incredibly pretty. It completely broke your fragile ego, totally dismantled all your toxic dependencies, and forcefully made you bravely sit exactly with deep silence, right until you clearly heard your very own absolute truth vastly louder than the entire world's noisy opinions. That deep silence absolutely didn't completely destroy you. It beautifully rebuilt you. And exactly when you perfectly finally came totally out of it, you were absolutely no longer desperately seeking cheap belonging. You were perfectly embodying pure authenticity. The exact people who once deeply pitied your heavy isolation completely now deeply resent your beautiful independence. They clearly see the massive power that beautifully came completely from your highly private suffering, and it completely disturbs them. You bravely endured exactly what they constantly avoid: the painful detox of deep separation, and the beautiful rebirth that perfectly comes directly from pure solitude. They absolutely can't possibly understand exactly how you beautifully found deep peace completely outside of the normal pack, entirely because they have deeply mistaken chaotic noise for a real connection. They perfectly still heavily measure their deep worth entirely by exactly who loudly applauds them. Completely, while you have beautifully learned exactly that true divine alignment absolutely doesn't ever need a loud audience. Your true awakening absolutely didn't make you heavily superior. It beautifully made you entirely sovereign. You absolutely no longer desperately cling. You absolutely no longer desperately beg to be deeply understood. And that completely unsettles exactly the people who heavily depend entirely on others for their own identity. They absolutely can't possibly comprehend exactly how you bravely survived the deep loneliness that they frantically run completely away from daily. Exactly what they loudly call heavy isolation, you beautifully call perfect transformation. You perfectly came totally out of that deep spiritual wilderness, vastly sharper, incredibly lighter, and beautifully freer. And that is exactly why they absolutely can't possibly stand your deep calm. Entirely. Because it perfectly reminds them completely of the beautiful freedom they absolutely could have totally had if they had just been brave enough to actively face themselves. Number 13. You beautifully found out exactly that real true power absolutely doesn't perform. You perfectly realized exactly that true strength absolutely doesn't need a loud audience, and the absolute truth absolutely doesn't require any cheap applause. You completely stopped desperately trying to actively prove yourself exactly to people heavily addicted entirely to fake appearances. Completely, while others constantly flex just for cheap attention, you beautifully conserve your pure energy entirely for deep purpose. You have perfectly learned exactly that real divine authority absolutely doesn't need a loud microphone. It beautifully speaks completely through steady consistency, through pure presence, and entirely through real results that absolutely can't be totally faked. That is exactly what deeply unsettles them. They have completely built their fragile identity entirely on a fake performance. Completely, while you have beautifully built yours entirely on deep essence. You absolutely no longer actively engage exactly in cheap power theatrics. You have clearly seen exactly how normal people heavily use fake dominance exactly as a cheap costume, desperately trying to heavily mask deep insecurity entirely with toxic aggression or a desperate need for validation. But real, true power absolutely doesn't frantically chase cheap validation. It beautifully carries true direction. You absolutely don't desperately seek exactly to be publicly seen. You beautifully move perfectly in deep alignment completely with something vastly higher. That is exactly why you are incredibly hard to accurately predict. You absolutely don't operate entirely from a fragile ego. You perfectly operate completely from pure clarity. And true clarity, by its very nature, absolutely doesn't ever compete. You have beautifully become entirely immune exactly to the silly game of fake appearances, completely because you perfectly understand exactly that a fake performance totally fades the exact moment the absolute truth perfectly enters the room. They absolutely can't stand exactly that your true strength is incredibly quiet, yet totally undeniable. You absolutely don't loudly broadcast all your moves, yet absolutely everything all around you perfectly shifts. You absolutely don't loudly announce exactly what you will perfectly do, yet it beautifully gets totally done. That is exactly the specific kind of pure energy they absolutely can't possibly copy entirely, because it is absolutely not built exactly on cheap tactics. It is perfectly built entirely on pure authenticity. You have completely stopped desperately trying exactly to look incredibly powerful and beautifully started actually becoming incredibly powerful. And that is absolutely something that completely can't be totally staged. It is absolutely not about toxic intimidation or tight control. It is entirely about complete self-mastery. You absolutely no longer heavily react exactly to toxic manipulation entirely, because you have perfectly learned exactly that deep silence perfectly can be the absolute loudest beautiful declaration of true control. And that is exactly what completely rattles people who constantly perform fake power. Your deep calm perfectly makes all their chaotic noise look incredibly desperate. They perfectly realize exactly what they falsely call true strength is really just a cheap spectacle, completely, while exactly what you beautifully carry is true substance. You have perfectly proven exactly that real, true power absolutely isn't about perfectly being totally on top. It is entirely about beautifully being completely untouchable. Absolutely not because you frantically hide, but entirely because you absolutely no longer play their silly game. They loudly perform entirely for cheap attention. You beautifully act entirely from deep alignment. They desperately seek cheap validation. You beautifully seek massive impact. And exactly in that massive difference beautifully lies the incredible, quiet brilliance exactly of your absolute truth. Completely unbothered, totally unshakable, and absolutely undeniable. Number 14. You beautifully became the exact mirror they absolutely fear the most. You absolutely didn't actively set out to deeply threaten absolutely anyone. You beautifully simply became totally authentic, and that pure authenticity perfectly turned completely into a massive confrontation exactly for absolutely all those still heavily living right behind fake masks. You absolutely don't actively attack them. You beautifully expose them completely without ever saying a single word. Your massive growth perfectly reflects their total stagnation. Your massive courage beautifully reveals their deep fear. Your radical self-honesty perfectly highlights their deep denial. And completely instead of being deeply inspired, incredibly many rapidly become highly defensive entirely because it is vastly easier to heavily resent the clear mirror than it is to actively face exactly what is perfectly in it. You have perfectly learned exactly that most normal people absolutely don't truly fear deep evil. They entirely fear pure awareness. True awareness forcefully demands real change, and real change heavily threatens cozy comfort. You perfectly represent absolutely everything they completely abandoned entirely inside themselves. The beautiful dream they totally gave up, the strong voice they completely silenced, the absolute truth they actively ignored. Exactly when they carefully look completely at you, they perfectly see their own unlived, beautiful life quietly staring straight back. That is absolutely not deep hatred you constantly feel directly from them. It is pure, deep projection. You perfectly remind them exactly of the massive potential they easily traded entirely for cheap approval. And that is exactly a hard truth, vastly too incredibly heavy exactly for their fragile egos to ever carry. The beautiful irony perfectly is, you absolutely don't heavily judge them. You beautifully just perfectly live entirely in deep alignment, completely with your absolute truth. And that beautiful fact alone perfectly becomes massive judgment entirely enough. You are a walking, breathing, beautiful mirror exactly what they absolutely could have totally been if they had just beautifully chosen bravery, completely over cheap belonging. Your very existence proudly says that it is absolutely possible, and that true sentence alone perfectly exposes every single cheap excuse they have absolutely ever made. That is exactly why they heavily twist your pure motives, loudly mock your deep peace, or constantly gossip exactly about your beautiful transformation. It perfectly helps them totally avoid any real accountability entirely for their very own deep spiritual laziness. You are absolutely not their dark villain. You are their beautifully unfinished true story. And that is exactly what they absolutely can't ever forgive. Absolutely not that you beautifully changed, but entirely that you perfectly proved exactly that they absolutely could have too. The absolute truth perfectly is they absolutely don't heavily hate you exactly because you proudly think you are vastly better. They heavily hate exactly that you completely stopped falsely pretending you were incredibly smaller. You completely stopped actively dimming your beautiful light exactly to perfectly make others incredibly comfortable, and that perfectly made them actively confront exactly how incredibly much of themselves they have perfectly dimmed exactly to stay comfortably accepted. You have beautifully become the clear reflection they absolutely can't easily edit. The exact one that perfectly shows them every single absolute truth they have desperately tried to heavily hide completely under a fake performance. And that is exactly why they loudly call your pure confidence deep arrogance, your deep peace massive pride, and your beautiful independence dark rebellion. Absolutely not because you truly are those dark things, but entirely because you perfectly expose the incredibly high cost of their sad compromise. Absolutely everything we have beautifully explored right here perfectly leads entirely to exactly one completely undeniable, absolute truth. You are absolutely not just totally awake. You are completely unshakable. You have beautifully become totally unprogrammable, perfectly embodying exactly what most completely only loudly preach, but absolutely never truly live. You beautifully move exactly with a pure frequency that perfectly exposes dark deception, a pure presence that fiercely demands true integrity, and a deep clarity that perfectly makes fake illusions completely crumble all around you. Every single brave step you have beautifully taken, every single absolute truth you have perfectly embraced, has completely dismantled the heavy, invisible cages that tightly held absolutely not only you, but exactly everyone all around you completely in quiet, sad obedience. You absolutely no longer actively participate exactly in their silly games. You absolutely no longer actively feed their toxic control. And you absolutely no longer desperately need cheap validation exactly to deeply prove your true worth. Your amazing journey perfectly shows exactly that real true freedom absolutely isn't about loud rebellion or loud empty statements. It is entirely about perfect alignment. It is entirely about beautifully becoming a living, breathing signal exactly of absolute truth, a perfect reflection that flawlessly exposes every single fake pretense, and a pure presence that perfectly, silently, beautifully redefines true power, massive courage, and true sovereignty. You have bravely walked completely through massive chaos, heavily endured deep solitude, and fiercely faced the heavy storms of true awakening. Absolutely not to proudly show off massive strength, but entirely to beautifully cultivate a deep peace that absolutely cannot be violently stolen. The vast universe absolutely doesn't heavily reward chaotic noise or fake performative loyalty. It beautifully honors true integrity, deep patience, and the massive courage exactly to beautifully embody exactly what incredibly many completely fear to actively face. Your beautiful life completely now perfectly speaks a pure language that absolutely can't be loudly debated, entirely only beautifully witnessed. You have perfectly learned exactly that the absolute truth absolutely isn't a simple concept, a casual conversation, or absolutely even a basic opinion. It is a powerful vibration that perfectly rearranges absolutely everything it beautifully touches. It perfectly destabilizes dark falsehoods, completely dismantles the cozy, comfortable dark lies people heavily build fragile identities entirely around, and perfectly exposes the true currency exactly of deep deception. You have beautifully become a clear mirror, a quiet divine authority, and a living, breathing proof exactly what true freedom perfectly looks exactly like when it is absolutely no longer up for negotiation. And exactly in beautifully embodying all this, you have perfectly made all their massive chaos entirely irrelevant, all their dark manipulation completely ineffective, and all their fake illusions incredibly, painfully transparent. You completely didn't just totally awaken. You beautifully redefined exactly what it perfectly means, exactly, to live completely awake. This is your beautiful divine invitation, perfectly to deeply remember your massive power, perfectly to boldly hold your deep clarity completely without any apology, and perfectly to confidently walk straight through this beautiful life, completely with the absolute, unshakable deep knowledge exactly that your true freedom, your pure integrity, and your absolute truth perfectly are your ultimate, massive dominion. Your amazing journey absolutely isn't just deeply personal, it is completely revolutionary. If this message resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss insights that challenge, empower, and awaken you. Like this video to show that truth matters more than comfort. Comment below and share your thoughts. Your perspective might be the spark someone else needs to wake up. And share this video with those ready to see the world through clarity instead of illusion. Stand in your truth because the world needs witnesses like you. God bless you. Amen.